Hello, this is Dr. John Schumpert. I'm an occupational and environmental medicine physician, and today I'm going to be giving you a brief overview on the AMA Guide 6th edition. My course objectives today are for you to gain an understanding of the reasons why the AMA Guide's 5th edition was changed to its current form in the 6th edition. I also hope that you'll gain an understanding of what this new paradigm embraced by the 6th edition actually means. And then finally, I hope you'll gain an understanding of the metrics used in order to calculate an impairment using the 6th edition of the AMA guides. There were a number of criticisms of earlier editions of the AMA guides. And when I say earlier editions, currently I'm thinking about editions prior to the 5th edition. Some of those criticisms included that those editions did not provide a comprehensive, valid, reliable, unbiased, evidence-based rating system. They were often just thought up on the fly by a group of physicians with or without medical literature support. Another criticism was that these impairment ratings did not adequately and accurately reflect the loss of function in an individual. And then finally, the numerical ratings were more representative of a legal fiction rather than medical reality. Although many changes were made to the AMA Guide's 5th edition to correct these deficiencies, problems persisted. And that was because the 5th edition still adhered to antiquated and confusing terminology. It also had limited validity and reliability of the ratings. And there was a lack of meaningful and consistent application of functional assessment tools. And finally, there was a lack of internal consistency within the guides from one body part to another. Finally, there was a high error rate reported among all of the ratings. Because of the deficiencies in the AMA Guide's 5th edition, a number of recommendations were put forth. One was the use of a standardized assessment of activities of daily living limitations associated with the physical impairment. Another was the inclusion of measures of functional loss in the impairment rating process. And then another recommendation was a way of improving intra-rater and inter-rater reliability and internal consistency. The AMA Guide 6th edition represents a paradigm shift in how impairment ratings are performed when compared to all previous editions of the AMA Guides. The 6th edition adopted the terminology of the International Classification of Functioning, Disability, and Health concept of disablement. The 6th edition becomes more diagnosis-based compared to previous editions, and these diagnoses are evidence-based whenever possible. The 6th edition also attempted to simplify the process to provide a higher level of inter-rater, which means between raters, and intra-rater, which means within a certain rater doing the same impairment rating over time, reliability. The AMA Guide 6th edition adopted new definitions for the terms impairment, disability, and impairment rating. Impairment is now defined as a significant deviation, loss, or loss of use of any body structure or function. And that includes loss or loss of use of body parts or functions such as eyes, ears, heart, lungs, finger, or back. Disability involves activity limitations and/or participation restrictions. So this is where we actually are starting to see a little bit of a move towards what we would call work restrictions factored into the actual impairment rating. Impairment ratings are considered consensus-derived percentage estimates of the loss of activity reflecting severity for a given health condition and include a degree of associated limitations in terms of the individual's ability to perform activities of daily living. There are two caveats to the use of the AMA guides. The first is that the AMA guides is not intended to be used to make direct estimates of work restrictions. That's what a functional capacity evaluation is for. That's what a physician history and physical examination are for. The AMA guides process for performing an impairment rating is not for that. On the other hand, once an impairment rating has been established, that impairment percentage is not something that can be used to directly measure work restrictions. And so if a person has a 10% whole person impairment, that does not necessarily mean that they have the workability of someone who can only perform sedentary work or medium work or heavy or very heavy work. There is no equation between the magnitude of the impairment rating and the person's ultimate work restrictions. The AMA guide defines two domains of human personal function, and these are mostly affected by impairments. And these domains of human function affected by impairments include mobility and self-care. Mobility can be broken down into the ability to either transfer or to ambulate. By definition, a transfer is the movement of one's body position while remaining at the same point in space. So it might mean going from a supine position lying on one's back to rolling over onto one side, or to go from a supine position to a sitting position, or from a sitting position to a standing position. Ambulation, in turn, means movement in space. And that movement could be by walking, it could be by climbing stairs or a ladder, it could be by moving through the use of a wheelchair. All of these are considered in the AMA Guide 6th edition as forms of ambulation. Self-care is broken down into two categories, those of activities of daily living and what are termed instrumental activities of daily living. Activities of daily living are basic self-care activities performed in one's personal sphere, while instrumental activities of daily living are complex self-care activities. And I'll give you some examples of each. So some examples of activities of daily living could include bathing, showering, grooming, functional mobility, toileting. These are examples that are often evaluated during the impairment process. Examples of instrumental activities of daily living could include child rearing, caring for pets, meal preparation and cleanup, home establishment and maintenance, health maintenance and management, taking care of others, financial management. All of these are considered instrumental activities of daily living. As I mentioned earlier, I hope to give you a basic overview of the impairment process within the 6th edition of the AMA Guides. There are a number of different types of impairment ratings that do not fit this basic impairment grid structure, such as hearing loss impairments, visual impairments, and range of motion impairments. But in general terms, if you are going to do an impairment rating using a basic diagnosis as the basis for the impairment, this basic structure will be what you'll see. So each impairment grid has a structure, and that structure includes 5 classes, and they usually go from class 0 to class 4. And that again has been chosen to be consistent with this international classification of functioning. And each class has a range of impairments that's associated with it. And those ranges of impairments for each class in the impairment grid vary by the body part being described. And so the class 1 impairment for a headache has a range of impairments that is different from the class 1 impairment for a neck strain. And that in turn is different from a class 1 impairment for a meniscus tear. And that in turn is different from a class 1 impairment for a rotator cuff tear. It depends on the body part as to the range of impairments for each impairment class. This is an example of a generic impairment classification grid. Across the top row, you can see the different impairment classes from class 0 to class 4, and that is an organizational schema that's used throughout the AMA guides. In this particular impairment grid template, you see a format that you'll see used in a number of more specialized impairment ratings, such as the pulmonary impairment ratings or the cardiovascular impairment ratings. So instead of having lots of non-key factors, you'll have an impairment grid like this, and within the impairment grid on the rows below the impairment class, you'll see a way to rate the person in terms of history of clinical presentation, a way to rate them in terms of their actual physical examination findings, and a way to rate them in terms of their clinical studies or other objective test results. And in the text of the AMA guides, you'll note that there are times when, in terms of clinical history or clinical presentation, they might meet the criteria for impairment class 1, but physical examination may mean they meet class 2, and clinical studies may in turn mean that they meet class 2 or class 1. And there's a couple of strategies used. One is to average the classes to determine the ultimate impairment class before moving ahead with an impairment rating. Another is to use the highest impairment class as the basis for your default impairment. In the bottom row, you'll see functional history, and that's really not a part of the impairment grid, although they put it in this table. That's really a part of evaluation of non-key factors. The process of assigning an impairment rating under the AMA Guide 6th edition requires the evaluator to do two things. First, using the diagnosis that is the basis of the impairment rating, the evaluator determines a key factor. So that key factor might be the diagnosis of a knee meniscus tear. After that, the evaluator determines non-key factors for the individual and their meniscus tear. And so they obtain a functional history for the person, they do a physical examination on the person, and if relevant and applicable, they might do clinical studies, x-rays, an MRI, or some other study to actually determine these non-key factors. And I'll go into how they are used shortly. So our sample impairment grid again shows all the different types of evaluations for an impairment on the top. But in the bottom, you see that last row, it says functional history, and that really involves a non-key factor, the functional history assessment or functional history adjustment. And as you can see, it also has 5 categories, but instead of impairment classes, we call these grade modifiers. And they are grade modifiers going from 0 to 4. So in summarizing, in order to determine impairment rating in the 6th edition, first you determine that the individual is at maximum medical improvement. Then you establish a reliable diagnosis for each body part or body region that has to be rated. Then you use the appropriate regional and or body part grid to determine the impairment class. I propose to use the lumbar spine impairment grid to illustrate how an impairment rating is done using the AMA Guide 6th edition and using a specific diagnosis. And so for the sake of this presentation, we will assume that the person being rated for an impairment had an L4-5 disc herniation, underwent a discectomy, and has residual radicular symptoms and signs. If you look at this table, you'll see that disc herniation would fall under the heading of motion segment lesions. That includes intervertebral disc herniations. And if we have history from our review of the medical records that indicate that despite the discectomy, the person still has residual radiculopathy, that would put that person in impairment class 2, which includes a single level involvement and residual radiculopathy. And what then is done is the impairment rating is fixed within that impairment class and is called a default impairment. And the default impairment is always the middle value in the impairment class. And so for a class 2 impairment, the default impairment would be 12%. So now we have assigned a key factor default impairment of 12% for an L4-5 disc herniation with residual radiculopathy. Now we do the non-key factor analyses. The first non-key factor analysis is that of functional history. As I mentioned before, you'll notice on the first row, the top row, instead of impairment class, we have grade modifiers going from 0 to 4. And let's say, for the sake of argument, that this person has a grade modifier of 3. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that their pain disability questionnaire score was 125. And in addition, let's say, for sake of argument, that they have pain symptoms with minimal activity. So that would place them in the category of a grade modifier of 3. So we've analyzed the functional history. Now we perform our physical examination in order to do a physical examination grade modifier. In the case of spine, we are really mostly interested in signs or objective findings of radiculopathy. And let's say, for the sake of argument, that this person we are evaluating has 2 specific signs for radiculopathy. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that when we do a straight leg raise test on them, we reproduce the radicular pain. And for another physical examination finding, let's say, for the sake of argument, that he has lost his right knee jerk or patellar tendon reflex. So both of those findings, if you look at this table, the positive straight leg raise puts the person into the category of a grade modifier of 2, and the same is true if one has lost a tendon reflex. As you can see, the reflexes, if they're asymmetric and it's consistent with the radiculopathy, that also is a grade modifier of 2. And so now we have a functional history grade modifier of 3 and a physical examination grade modifier of 2. Finally, in the impairment process, we must do the clinical studies grade modifier, the last non-key factor in our impairment rating process. In this person's case, let's say, for the sake of argument, that he did have a right L4-5 disc herniation, and that was consistent with his presentation, and that would place him in a grade modifier of 2. And let's say, again, for the sake of argument, that that was also supported by a positive EMG showing an L5 radiculopathy on the right. So let's say that their clinical studies grade modifier is also that of 2. Now what we need to do is calculate a net adjustment to that default impairment rating. You'll recall that the key factor in our imaginary case is that of an L4-5 disc herniation with residual radiculopathy. It's a class 2 impairment with a default impairment rating of 12%. Now we are going to adjust that impairment rating either upward or downward in using our non-key factors to make that adjustment. So now we have a default impairment of 12% that needs to be adjusted, and we have done our non-key factor analysis of the individual in terms of functional history, physical examination, and clinical studies. You'll recall that his functional history grade modifier was 3. You'll also recall that the default impairment rating, or the class diagnosis, was that of 2. He had a class 2 impairment rating. And so the GMFH, or grade modifier for functional history of 3, minus the class of diagnosis, which is 2, would be equal to 1. In the same token, because they had a grade modifier for physical examination of 2, and you subtract the class of the impairment of 2, you get 0. And the same is true when doing the grade modifier for clinical studies. That minus the impairment class is 0. And so the net adjustment is actually only 1. So down at the bottom of this little table, you'll see that the default impairment rating is the grade C. And when you move up or down from that default impairment rating, you do so using the results of your net adjustment. But one of the principles of the AMA Guide 6th edition is that once the key factor impairment class has been established, you never leave that class. So in this case, we only have a grade modifier, a net adjustment of 1. So instead of C, we would go to D, and we would add 1 to, in this case, to the impairment rating. But for instance, if for whatever reason we had, and I've had this happen, where the net adjustment is 4 or 5, either minus 4 or 5 or positive 4 or 5, that doesn't necessarily mean, that doesn't mean at all that you move out of that impairment class. You remain in the impairment class, but you butt up on the boundary of it. So if you had a net adjustment of minus 4, you would only end up with grade A. You would be at the lowest end of that impairment class. And the same is true if you had a net adjustment of 5. You would only be at grade E, the upper end of that impairment class. You never leave the impairment class once it has been established. So now we use that regional grid, the lumbar spine grid, to identify the appropriate numerical impairment rating for this impairment class and grade. And remembering that our net adjustment was 1. So if you look at this table, we are in impairment class 2 under the heading of motion segment lesions, and our default impairment was 12. We have made a net adjustment of 1, and so now this person's impairment will be 13% whole person for the L4-5 disc herniation that was surgically removed, and now the individual has a residual radiculopathy that's proven both by physical examination and based upon electrodiagnostic and imaging studies. So that gives you an overview of how the impairment ratings are done, or should be done, according to the AMA Guide 6th edition. And I hope if you have any questions about this, or if you would like to hear about other forms of impairment ratings, such as hearing loss impairments or impairments that utilize range of motion, that you'll let me know. I'd be happy to go over that process with you. So to summarize, the 6th edition of the AMA Guide represents a paradigm shift which adopts this contemporary model of disablement instead of the traditional model that is purely based upon physical function. The same level of injury does not predict an individual's ability to participate in major life functions. Disability may be influenced by physical and psychological and psychosocial factors that can change over time, particularly psychosocial factors such as aging. The AMA Guides is not intended to be used to directly estimate someone's work restrictions, and once you have a permanent impairment, you can't use that to predict what types of physical restrictions that individual might require. So at that point, I'll conclude. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me at my email, which is jcs@reoh.com. And I'll be happy to take any questions that you have. Thank you for your attention.